Kia ora, welcome to Baha'i On Air. I'm Bev Watson. In this episode we'll be speaking with Dr. Arini Beaumaris from Australia. We invited Arini to come to New Zealand as the guest speaker for this year's Margaret Stevenson Memorial Lecture. Welcome to New Zealand, Arini. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, Bev, and it's great to be here.
Tell us about the lecture. How did that go?
Well, it was very well received, and I was speaking about the age-old question, is that often we know what is the right thing to do, but we don't do it. And so coming from an educational background, I was interested in trying to understand what's in that gap between moral judgment and moral action and the implications for education.
And you were just speaking at a conference in China right before this on roughly the same subject, is that right?
Yes, I gave a session on cultivating morality in early childhood, because one of the things that we find out is that most of the foundation for developing a moral capacity is laid down before the age of 5, which of course in the past many parents were at home to be able to do, or grandparents that assisted in that area, and of course now it has huge implications for being able to look at the development in institutional settings as well. But we also were invited to speak on the Baha'i approach to spiritual education as well. Ah,
wow. So, okay, tell us about that.
Well, that was because it was a conference, first time ever held in China, which really brought together Eastern and Western thinkers in moral education, is that we were exploring those perspectives. And of course, the Bahá'í Faith bridges both the Eastern approach and the Western approach to spiritual development. And what I talked about at this memorial lecture was, how do we help children to make wise moral choices? Mm-hmm. And it's just like we learn to think, or we learn to do mathematics, that we learn to be moral in the same way that we learn to read and write, which really in a way changes our focus, because we tend to think that we get children to behave through shaming them, or through deprivation, or through consequences, rather than understanding that it's actually focusing on and encouraging them to act out on these positive or virtuous behaviours.
So now that most mothers, or a great many mothers, are actually out at work and aren't there with their children in those early preschool years that are so important, how does that impact on the development of the child and their ability to make good moral decisions?
Well, I think that parents can still be highly effective in the time that they are with their children, but they need to be more intentional in what they do. And so, for example, one of the things that I know that's really critical is that when we tend to wait until the child does the inappropriate action, and then we want to correct that because we feel that they've got to be appropriately socialised. So what they found was that if we actually name the behaviour, so for example, they found that empathy is the foundation to morality, develops between 18 months and 2 years of age. And so when a child actually is wanting to do that, they share their food, and we say, oh, it's yours, you eat it, rather than understanding that you actually say at that stage, thank you very much, it's very kind of you to share your food, would you like it back? And so it's the idea that whatever action you name the virtue, and you name the action that describes that particular virtue. Can you articulate spiritual transformation, and can you replicate it? And so as a result of being able to try and identify what were the moral and ethical capabilities for the child living in the 21st century, and implementing that for a year, we got these astounding results. And I'm thinking, we've made so many changes, but what were those changes and why did they work?
How do parents, the average parent out there, just find out about how to do this right, how to do it well?
Well, I think there's a number of movements that are very encouraging now, and there's a big focus through the university sector on positive parenting, which is about encouraging the child to do the appropriate action. But I think that what I found in my doctoral studies is quite revolutionary. We've tended to think that guilt and shame will get a child to do the appropriate thing, and we've tended to externalise rewards. And so this is really a relatively new field, and so it's beginning to be merging together, and that's one of the reasons that I've developed a series of little books for children on helping parents to help children to make wise moral choices. And I've used little characters that come from the land of light that help the child to actually identify, the steps that they can take, and the parents can also use this as a discipline approach.
Tell us how you came to reach this understanding about the importance of moral development.
I had the really great opportunity to be the principal of an international Baha'i school in Vancouver Island in Canada. And so I was working with children from about 35 different countries, and I realised that we needed to have an intentional character education program. And the research now, of course, identifies that we need to become both learned and good, and I was able to demonstrate that by introducing this program. 64% of our students ended up on the honours roll for the British Columbian government. So I realised that there was something really important here and that I needed to research it to find out what would actually work.
So, and that, the learned and good thing, that sounds very much as if it's based on something you know from the Baha'i writings.
Yes, this is a quotation from the Baha'i writings, which are greatly inspired, I guess, the approach of understanding that children are inherently good. They have all the potential gems hidden within them, but it's the educative process that is necessary to be able to cut and polish those particular gems.
And so the Baha'i writings actually quite inspire and guide your work in many ways?
Well, in the Baha'i writings, it's one of the few revelations, I guess, where there's a tremendous amount of insight and understanding about the importance of early education of children, and that the mother is the first educator of the children, and that we should focus on the good points of a child rather than focusing on what they don't do.
And it wasn't really until I was at Maxwell International Baha'i School in Canada that I really was forced to look very deeply and very closely at the Baha'i writings on education, and particularly rectitude and refinement of character, that I really started to say, what are really the concepts the faith is talking about? And what do we do in our outside world and the outside community that we have come with certain traditions and certain interpretations of how we view some of these concepts? And how true are they in relationship to the concepts of what the faith is talking about in this particular area?
So how did you become a Baha'i?
Well, my mother was a very adventurous lady in that she took about 10 years to have the courage to become a Baha'i, but her aunt, who had been one of, in fact, the early believers in Adelaide in South Australia, she became a Baha'i because she saw that it really brought together all the beliefs of all the different religions. She could never understand why there were so many different religions worshipping the same God.
Actually, that's something that people often say about the Baha'i Faith. If they know nothing else about it, they say, oh, the Baha'i Faith's very inclusive, isn't it? And which, of course, it is, because it encapsulates all of the other faiths. Mm-hmm. But what is the point of difference that makes the Baha'i Faith unique and necessary rather than just another religion in today's world?
Well, I think that we now live in a multicultural society based on many pluralistic values, and we are really struggling, I think, to understand how do we create a world civilization, which we're seeing more and more. The need for globalisation and certainly the economic situation is demonstrating the importance of nations working together. So for me personally, when I was a small child, I was inspired by the vision of the disciples of Christ, and the stories about how they'd had the courage and capacity to recognise the teachings of Christ in the early stages. And I had sort of had this very, I guess, childlike vision of saying, I wish I'd been one of those people who'd had the courage to accept Christ when it was not the popular thing to do. And so when I had the opportunity to become a Baha'i, I realised that the teachings were like a blueprint for creating a world civilization, which to me was very exciting, because I think in many ways we've lost our way. We've tried all the different sorts of isms and they have found to be wanting. And what the Baha'i Faith offered for me was a beautiful way of seeing how we could be united and yet accept our diversity and value and appreciate the very differences that we all have.
Right. And so you're a member of the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of Australia, the national governing body.
Yeah, yes, that's correct. Yes.
And you've served on that institution for quite a number of years?
Yes, 14 years originally, and then I was overseas for 9, and I've now been serving for the last 3 years. So it's really what's the most fascinating thing for me is to see how, as our world circumstances deteriorate in our political environment, how the Baha'i writings and the Baha'i teachings have this amazing system of governance, which is, I think we're struggling to understand if we move to a global civilization. How do we govern a series of independent nation states. And so the Baha'i writings have this unique system of being able to capture the input from the grassroots in the local level, to be able to coordinate affairs at the national level and yet link to an international body in Haifa, Israel, which has the role of interpretation of the writings and to look at the future development of the whole Baha'i world community.
So tell us, Arini, what is it that the Baha'is do to help move us forward to this point where we are ready for the international governance system that you've just referred to?
Well, Baha'u'llah's teachings, and perhaps we should pause a moment and reflect upon the name Baha'u'llah, which is, we can rather foreign sounding name, but it means in English the glory of God. And his mission was to bring about the unity of the whole human race by demonstrating that all religion has come from the same source, the one God, and has been revealed at a time, and its messages have been appropriate to the social conditions that we find ourselves in. So today we are struggling with understanding how do we bring all these diverse nations together to work as one unified whole and yet still accept our diversity. So Baha'u'llah had a vision that in the future we would see an independent global community and that we would go through really a major spiritual transformation. And we see that in our current world we've really become very focused on the material civilization, and so that his teachings really try and address that process of bringing that back into balance. We're starting at the grassroots level and really sort of seeing how we can get communities to take ownership of creating a spiritual community where children feel safe, where our young people feel that they can contribute to the in-service activities, to the advancement of their local community, and where people can prayerfully reflect and to talk about really what are the issues that impact their community and feel empowered to make a difference. So that we start with this basic building block at the community level, certainly before that even at the family level.
So, I mean, your whole emphasis in your work is on the moral development of children. So how is that working with what the Baha'i children's classes, for example?
Well, the Baha'i children's classes are very much about the spiritual education of the child, and that's, first of all, I guess, is to recognise that we are spiritual beings and that we have a creator, and that we become involved in the worshipping of that creator by learning prayers. You know, in a way we would see prayers as conversation with God. We talk about meditation, I guess that is opening the heart and listening and understanding that what is the message that we need to do when we are trying to work out how do we live our daily lives. And so with young children we have a particular focus on understanding about the virtuous behaviour that is necessary as a spiritual being. And that we can look to the lives of the early founders and the great teachers that are within the Baha'i community. So it's not about a process of indoctrination, because we engage children from the wider community and parents that want to see their children experience a spiritual education. And so we're looking more at the broader ideas of ourselves of how do we live our day-to-day life, how do we solve the challenges. You know, currently at the moment we have a lot of children that are experiencing bullying, and to me that is just the lack of spiritual qualities, that of being gentle, of being considerate, of being empathetic. And we tend to become, you know, involved in how do we stop bullying rather than understanding that it's actually a spiritual disease that we're dealing with here. And if we teach children to be kind and to be gentle and to be considerate, then many of these disaffected behaviours fall away.
And you also mentioned about the youth and their contribution, their ability to contribute to the community. And I know the Junior Youth Empowerment Program that the Baha'i community runs throughout the world is geared towards doing exactly that.
Yes, and educationally, as a developmental stage, as children between the ages of 11 and 14 really have a missionary zeal about wanting to see the world to become a better place. And I think that we've often, as a community, not actually empowered young people to be outward looking and to look at their communities and to see how they can work with it. For example, one of the things that I know in Australia is that they met some of the young people in the community that were creating graffiti. in the area, and so they encourage these people to be participating in the youth empowerment program, which is really looking at the sort of moral choices and the day-to-day activities and how do you go about it. It's not about teaching people about the Baha'i Faith, but rather about how do you live your day-to-day life. And they became so enamoured of this particular program and that the shop that they'd graffitied on, they decided that they needed to make amends for this, and so they actually went to the shopkeeper and said, I would like to really apologise, and is there some sort of service activity that we could do to make amends for what we've done? And the shop owner was so impressed that these young people could actually reflect upon their behaviour and then not only reflect upon it but then want to make it good, you know, in the way that they're working with. And I think that this is really an important thing for adults to look at with their young people, is that they've got all this energy, this restless energy, and they want to do something with it. And so the more that we can actually create our communities, which in many ways we've lost a sense of community because everybody's so busy working and not doing, but to really help our young people, to train them to be effective in this way and to work with the wider community to be able to do projects and activities that are going to be meaningful to the whole community. And also these junior youth are very good at working with like the children, you know, sort of, and providing sort of service and activities for the children. So, you know, it's really developing their capacity to contribute to service.
So that we've covered the children, we've covered the youth. What about adults? How do they fit into this?
Well, I think there's a great spiritual thirst at the moment with adults, and we've just been on this journey around the world. And one of the things that you see is that people really feel this sort of desire to connect with people and to find a way of being able to explore topics that are meaningful to them. And so one of the things that we offer is a space for people to come together and to pray, and you can bring any writings from any of the great world religions, and that you use these and take particular topics, for example, understanding the role and status of women, and having something that we focus on in that particular area, so that any of these themes then become also the cause for discourse, for talking about, you know, what we can do to actually solve some of these problems. So that we tend to think, well, the government has to fix that, or the council needs to fix that, rather than understanding the more we actually talk together and find the creative solutions at the grassroots level, which is what we're doing in the neighbourhoods, is bringing people together of like-minded thought to replenish ourselves and to be able to develop this creative capacity to worship God, but also to use the creative word of God.
In case you've just joined us, we're speaking with Dr. Arini Beaumaris from Australia. We invited Arini to come to New Zealand as the guest speaker for this year's Margaret Stevenson Memorial Lecture. Margaret Stevenson, for those who don't know, but I know you do, Arini, was the very first Baha'i in New Zealand. She became a Baha'i in 1912 as a result of her sister in London sending her a newspaper article that she had seen about the son of the founder of the Baha'i Faith speaking at a function in London. At first she didn't take too much notice of it, but eventually she did, and she became Baha'i in 1912. And I'm sure that you can tell us something about the early Baha'is in Australia.
Well, I think there's an interesting connection between Margaret Stevenson and some of the early Baha'is. Effie Baker, for example, was the second person to become a Baha'i in Australia, and that was in the early 20s. And she and Margaret went on pilgrimage together to Haifa, which is the world centre of the Baha'i Faith, in 1925. And I think that there's been this sort of sister community between, in the early stages, we had one national body between New Zealand and Australia. So we go back a long way, and I think that it really demonstrates that there were these exemplary women who had great courage to really be prepared to investigate for themselves the claims of Baha'u'llah, that he was the promised one of all ages, and found that they actually couldn't resist this desire to be part of a really transforming process of creating a global civilization.
Now, Margaret Stevenson was a middle-aged single woman when she became a Baha'i, so she really stepped outside of all the social norms to become a member of the Baha'i Faith. Was Effie Baker's story in any way similar to that?
I think she was a younger woman, but it's similar in that she was very interested in the arts and photography. And she, when she went on pilgrimage with Margaret Stevenson, is that Shoghi Effendi, who was referred to as the guardian of the Baha'i Faith, who was the grandson and great-grandson of Baha'u'llah and the grandson of Abdu'l-Baha, who was the son of Baha'u'llah, had the opportunity to stay on in Haifa in Israel because they had just opened up a new pilgrim house, and she was invited to be the hostess to meet pilgrims that would come from all over the world to visit the Haifa and to experience being in the places, the holy places where Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Baha had lived.
And then I guess they came back, Effie Baker went back to Australia, and Margaret Stevenson came back to New Zealand.
Well, I think that actually Effie Baker didn't ever come back. I mean, not at that stage. She stayed for 11 years. And then she was given this special assignment to go into Iraq and Iran at that time because Shoghi Effendi was writing Nabil's narrative, which is a history of the evolution of the unfolding of the Baha'i Faith in Iran and many of the early history aspects. And they didn't have photographs of some of these places. And at that stage, as Persia was becoming more and more modernised, many of these landmarks were being removed, and so Shoghi Effendi felt that it was really important to record the early history and these places that are mentioned by these central figures and the early believers at that time. So it was a unique process because she had to go into Iran at that stage and wear a chador and be totally covered, which was probably an advantage for her because here we have a white woman going into this place, and she had to hide her photographic equipment so that they weren't aware that she was taking these photographs. But it's been an invaluable history for the Baha'i community because we now have photographs of many of these places that were part of the very early formation of the faith in Iran. And then I think there's an interesting relationship between Iran and Australia, interestingly, that that they were about to build a what we call a temple or Masjid al-Azkar, which is the place or house of worship, and they're about to build that in Iran. And because of the persecution of the Baha'is in Iran, they were unable to proceed with that building. And so they said in that case there would be the building of the Baha'i temple in Australia. And so in a way that difficulty they had in Iran resulted in Australia being one of the early houses of worship that was built in the world. And so this is an interesting connection between Iran and Australia.
I didn't realise that connection between Australia and Iran. That's interesting. And I understand that you have been at the dedication of quite a number of the 8 houses of worship that we now have throughout the world. Can you tell us about that?
Well, the first one I was at was when I was a young girl for the dedication of the Australian Baha'i House of Worship. And then I had the opportunity to go to the dedication in the mid-80s to both India and to Samoa. And the thing that's fascinating about going to these 3 different dedications is that all of the buildings, whilst they're very different designs, all have 9 sides. And the symbolism of that is that we may come from very different religious backgrounds, and the idea is that you can come from whatever background, come together and worship in unity the one God. And so, for example, I remember being in the Baha'i House of Worship in Samoa, and it has a unique design feature to it where you look up into the dome, but in the Samoan temple there is glass between each of the panels, and so you look up and you see the blue sky and the clouds going past, and it's really this really great sense of the sacred because it's built around the notion of Afali. And I think this is a beautiful thing about the Baha'i Faith, is that there is the respecting of the culture, and that whilst there might be a particular focus for each of the houses of worship, is that it really captures the unique cultural aspects of each of the countries they've been constructed in. For example, in India, it's in the shape of a lotus flower, and it's just truly beautiful and won many awards.
I know that some of the Baha'i holy places around Haifa and Akka have recently been made World Heritage Sites. Can you tell us anything about that?
Yes, I think this is a very wonderful recognition of the unique architectural contribution We have in Haifa the Shrine of the Bab, and that is the resting place of the remains of the Bab, who was the forerunner to Baha'u'llah, and eventually Abdul Baha was able to erect a structure around which ultimately the Shrine of the Bab, which is this magnificent building that sits on Mount Carmel, and just recently they've renovated it to upgrade the gold tiles that create this shining form. And because the Bab, so much of his time was spent in darkness, is that this is illumined every night, and so there's this tremendous sense of light and the glow that sort of emanates from Mount Carmel is truly magnificent.
Yes, actually one of the Baha'is in New Zealand, Bruce Hancock, was the person who was in charge of the laying of the golden tiles on the dome of the Shrine of the Bab when it was being refurbished recently. So it's quite a proud Kiwi connection there too.
I can imagine, and I think this is the remarkable thing about the Baha'i community, is that we see service as being one of the highest expressions of human endeavour, and so Baha'is are so willing to volunteer their time so that they can assist with these particular skills people have. So it's wonderful that you also have the recognition of these skills from a New Zealander.
Yes, yes. And coming back again to the houses of worship, tell us how they connect to this whole concept of service.
Well, we refer to them as the silent teachers, in that, for example, we've just had our 50th anniversary of the dedication of the Baha'i Temple in Australia, and the local mayor gave this wonderful presentation about saying how that this, for the 50 years that the Baha'i Temple has stood in Mona Vale, that it really has been a beacon, and he said not only of light, but he said also of hope for humanity. And that the purpose of these public houses of worship is that everybody is welcome to come to it as a place of prayer and meditation. But this is the early stages of the evolution of the Baha'i community, and the future vision is that around the temple will be a series of dependencies. And so, for example, senior citizens, or you have educational facilities or health facilities. So it's the idea that it should always be of service to humanity, and that the whole purpose of Baha'u'llah's revelation is to see a transformation in the lives of society and community where it's based on equality, where it's based on justice, where it's based on unity. And so the houses of worship really, as this mayor said, offer a beacon of hope to humanity, that it is possible for us to work collectively to change the fortunes of humanity.
It sounds, Arini, as if the Baha'i Faith really inspires and informs your whole life. It has a huge impact on your life.
I've been extremely fortunate, Bev, because I've had the opportunity to travel around the world many times, and this time is no exception, that no matter where you go, you meet with Baha'is and you see we're all working for the same purpose. The degree of joy, of love and harmony makes you realise it is possible to transform the fortunes of humanity.
Thank you so much for coming to New Zealand, Arini, for being part of this program for Baha'i On Air, and we look forward to having you back again sometime in the future. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure to be with you, Bev.
You've been watching Baha'i On Air. We've been talking to Dr. Arini Beaumaris from Australia. Hope we'll see you again next time. I'm Bev Watson. Ka kite.